Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos. A man sits at a kitchen table on a quiet hill, not far from the glitter of a city that runs on steel, concrete, and late-night deals. Outside, the streetlights paint thin gold lines across a driveway, and the hum of trucks from distant highways sounds like the ocean. He prefers his steak cooked just right, his shirts pressed, his decisions measured. Some call him Big Paul. Some call him a businessman. Some whisper that he decides who gets the job and who waits. He flips through business pages, thinks about delivery routes, concrete bids, and who owes what by Friday. He likes order and hates surprises. He came from a butcher's block to a mansion built like a statement. He never shouts if a quiet word works better. In living rooms, men lower their voices because his name carries weight. He learned early that silence is a currency. Tonight, he watches the clock, wondering who is loyal, who is careless, and how a city can be managed one handshake at a time. He was born in Brooklyn in 1915, the son of Sicilian immigrants who believed work came before comfort. His father cut meat for a living and expected precision, speed, and respect from anyone who stood near the counter. The boy learned to square his shoulders, keep his hands steady, and trust his own eyes. School ended early for him. He dropped out in 8th grade, stepping into a world where cash, inventory, and long hours taught more than any classroom. He carried the rhythm of a shop with him. Know your sources, keep the books straight, never waste a minute. He would later say he liked people who could deliver on promises. That outlook became his guide. By the mid-1930s, he already understood the Brooklyn streets, who ran them, who you could speak to, and what questions should never be answered. One teenage scrape with the law tested him. He was arrested in a store robbery case, pressed by police to name others. He kept quiet, took the hit for refusing to talk, and learned that silence bought long-term trust. That short stay behind bars for contempt was not a heroic chapter to him. It was a practical lesson. If he wanted a life where doors opened, he would need a reputation for not breaking under pressure. People noticed. Word traveled that the butcher's son could be relied on when the stakes rose. He married young and stayed married to a woman named Nina, building a home and a family as he pursued money with single-minded focus. He liked the idea of stability, a clean house, a dinner table set the same way every night, children provided for without worry. He wore suits even when he could have worn something casual, because the way a man dressed told people how to treat him. Family ties also linked him to others who were moving up in New York's underworld. Through marriage, he became connected to Carlo Gambino, a quiet man with a calm face and a gift for strategy. That relationship placed him close to rising power, and he was smart enough to learn exactly how to act. Never boastful, never sloppy, always practical. In the 1940s and 1950s, he shifted from the butcher shop to larger ventures. He built legitimate businesses in meat and poultry distribution, and grew them with the rigor of a true operator. Deliveries had to be on time, margins had to be watched, customers had to be kept happy. Behind that clean public picture, prosecutors would later say he used intimidation and inside leverage to secure routes and contracts, the kind of pressure that kept competitors out and fees flowing in. He built a reputation as someone who preferred white-collar rackets, extortion that wore a suit, payments that looked like consulting fees, and deals made in conference rooms instead of alleyways. Illegal gambling and loan sharking were part of the world he moved in, but he stood out for aiming at industries, not just street corners. He rose within the organization that would one day be called the Gambino family, first as a trusted ear, then as a captain in charge of a crew. He avoided the loud, chaotic side of the life. He believed in careful accounting, in measuring risk, in cultivating union influence that could steer entire sectors, trucking, meat distribution, construction, without anyone needing to raise their voice. He held that real leverage came from payrolls and schedules, from knowing which shop steward could place the right men on the right site, from understanding the cost of every hour of delay. If he could guide those levers, he could guide the money. Law enforcement pressure rose in the late 1950s after a high-profile gathering of figures from different families shocked the country. Investigators called witnesses, impaneled grand juries, and asked hard questions. He refused to cooperate and faced contempt charges again. It was the same lesson from his youth, repeated at a higher level: speak softly, say nothing to authorities, show patience, let lawyers handle paperwork. He spent time in custody, not for violence or theft, but for refusing to break the code. When he came home, Allies respected him more, and opponents understood that he would not be turned. By the early 1960s, the man who started on a butcher's block was being marked for bigger responsibilities. Carlo Gambino, who had taken control of the family after the violent 1957 power shift that removed Albert Anastasia, valued Big Paul for his preference for business over street drama. If some captains thought the old ways were fistfights and quick scores, Paul thought the future was in contracts, freight, garment center trucking, the ready mix the city needed for every high-rise, the collective bargaining agreements that could be nudged to favor those who knew how to apply quiet pressure. He kept himself removed from loud social clubs. He preferred a dining room and a kitchen conversation where he could steer minds even as he tasted the sauce. He began to put more effort into his own companies. Fronts and real firms alike grew under his hand. He invested in real estate, took positions in distribution outfits, and made introductions between labor and management. Investigators later accused him of extortion, bid rigging, and labor racketeering, charges that he always denied, but even his critics admitted he had discipline. He read business magazines, demanded updates from subordinates, and expected weekly envelopes from those who used his name as a shield. He rarely touched cash in public. He preferred to be paid in influence. That posture kept him out of reach when police knocked on doors at street level. Inside the family, his power base was Brooklyn and Staten Island. He collected men who were older, steadier, not the kind to make headlines by crashing sports cars or flashing jewelry. He wanted accountants, truck dispatchers, union delegates, supervisors in meat markets, foremen at loading docks. He was not a romantic figure. He did not give speeches about honor. He talked about deliveries, payrolls, and the cost of labor stoppages. If a building site halted for a day, someone paid. He wanted to be the one who got paid. When a rival argued for more dramatic tactics, he would raise an eyebrow and ask if the same result could be achieved with a phone call. None of that meant he stayed clean. By the late 1960s, his name appeared in law enforcement files tied to loan sharking, illegal gambling, and intimidation across multiple industries. Witnesses who worked on the docks or in union offices told grand juries about pressures to steer contracts, about fees collected for labor peace, and about the expectation that a cut of profits would go upstairs. He kept a careful buffer around himself. Orders passed through layers of loyal men. Meetings happened in kitchens, in cars, or in short, quiet walks around the block. It made him difficult to capture on tape or corner in a raid. He counted on that. During these years, a separate power center was growing within the same family. Agnello Della Croce, an old-school underworld figure with his own loyalists, especially downtown. Where Paul wore tailored suits and ate in quiet dining rooms, Della Croce held court at loud social clubs in Little Italy. They were two halves of the same machine. Carlo Gambino managed the balance, letting both men collect for the family. One focused on street rackets and the other on industry. That arrangement kept money flowing and avoided a civil war. In the early 1970s, Paul built a mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island, a broad white house with room for large family meals and discreet business talks. It looked like wealth with an orderly soul, symmetrical, clean, carefully guarded. He hosted dinners where pasta shared the table with business strategy. No shouting, no slamming of fists, just measured questions about routes, schedules, union officers, and which companies were making new moves in concrete or construction. He liked to talk with men who read ledgers and understood margins. He was also known for correcting grammar, for expecting manners, and for holding to a routine. Wake early, dress carefully, meet selectively, never be rushed. The government in those years was changing tactics too. After years of chasing individual crimes, prosecutors leaned into a broader federal statute called RICO, a law that let them tie together patterns of behavior, extortion, bribery, illegal gambling, into a single racketeering case. That shift threatened people like Paul more than any street raid. A paper trail could be as dangerous as a witness. He hired careful lawyers, limited his words, and demanded that crew bosses be more discreet. He made enemies among younger, flashier men who wanted fast money from narcotics. He banned drug dealing by his crews. He believed that kind of business drew heat and destroyed discipline. He was not naive about how much money drugs could make, but he thought it would wreck the family in the long run. That stance pleased many older figures and angered others who saw new profits slipping away. In 1976, Carlo Gambino died. On his deathbed, Carlo named Paul his successor. To avoid a split, Della Croce stayed on as underboss, and the two camps were told to work together. The announcement surprised some who expected Della Croce to take over, but Carlo's word settled it. Paul became boss of the largest family in the country, in charge of a network that touched construction sites, docks, trucking companies, garment warehouses, restaurants, casinos outside New York, and countless small businesses that paid for protection, for access, or for just staying out of trouble. He did not celebrate. He tightened the rules, insisted on more frequent reports, and pushed even harder into industries that could be organized and managed like formal business portfolios. As boss, he refined his approach. He preferred that captains keep violence low, that they place people in positions that mattered, union halls, purchasing departments, dispatch centers. He expanded influence in the ready-mix sector by supporting a closed circle of concrete firms that found ways to avoid price wars. Prosecutors later called it bid rigging, and a cartel, the so-called Concrete Club, and argued in court that it forced major builders to pay inflated prices on big projects. The defense would say it was ordinary competition or false testimony by cooperators hoping for lighter sentences. The truth of the accused scheme became a matter for juries. In public, Paul kept smiling photographs with his grandchildren on the mantle and read financial pages while finishing his espresso. He strengthened the family's hold over the trucking that fed the garment district and the deliveries that kept supermarkets stocked. He took a cut from illegal gambling, sports betting, and card games, but he treated those as steady streams rather than main engines. He valued labor peace because it was profitable. A strike that ended quickly often meant a fee had been paid. He liked to own the valve that turned trouble off. On holidays, he could be generous, handing out envelopes and gifts, yet he never let anyone forget the rule. Nothing is free, and every privilege has a price. Police followed him, but he rarely slipped. He traveled with drivers who were careful, and with aides who took calls for him. He did not boast in bars. He did not hold open meetings. He ran a family like a boardroom, and that made him strong. It also made him vulnerable in a new way. Federal agents were learning to plant microphones and to build long, patient cases that let recordings tell stories jurors could believe. He did not adjust to that threat as quickly as he had to others. Before those microphones came into play, the first years of his reign brought money and friction. Younger men chafed under his rules. Some captains thought the street should decide who rose next, not a whisper from a quiet house in Staten Island. He dismissed noisy complaints as unserious, and doubled down on neat ledgers and zero tolerance for narcotics in family crews. He was convinced that calm control would outlast any storm. He predicted that prosecutors would chase the loud ones and miss the steady hand. For now, though, the tables in his house stayed set at the same time each evening, and the men who visited him knew to speak softly. The new boss had come a long way from the butcher's counter. He didn't flaunt power. He organized it. Businesses that touched the city's daily life felt the invisible weight of his reach. Judges, juries, and journalists would soon take a sharper interest in how exactly that reach worked, and in the dollars that flowed because of it. He kept telling himself that he ran an empire like a set of ledgers. The government was getting ready to read those ledgers line by line. He tightened the screws on schedules and payrolls, turning meetings into short seminars on efficiency. Men came to his Staten Island house with neat notes and left with clearer orders. He liked precision. If a contractor needed 40 trucks on Monday, he wanted to know by Friday who was providing them, which union shop was on overtime, and how labor peace would be maintained. The city was changing. After near bankruptcy in the 1970s, New York was building again. Cranes moved like metronomes over Midtown, and every pour of concrete, every shipment of rebar, every garment rolling out of the district meant leverage if you knew where to push. He believed leverage lived in union halls and dispatch offices, not on street corners. He kept two truths close. First, money flowed cleanest through industries where delays were catastrophic and predictability was premium. Second, a boss who stayed away from chaos could last longer than one who chased quick scores. That was his compass. So he focused on sectors where an hour lost could cost a fortune: concrete, trucking, meat distribution, wholesale supply for groceries and restaurants. Prosecutors would later describe a pattern. Companies pressured to join an arrangement, bids steered, prices fixed, and a tax for labor peace. Defense lawyers called that fantasy and agenda-driven testimony. Jurors and judges would get the final word. Inside his house, he treated it simply as management. The garment district was one of his comfortable strongholds. Deliveries into narrow streets needed coordination. If a truck stalled, 15 shop floors could go quiet, and deadlines would be missed. Some shop owners chose to pay for smooth passage. The men taking envelopes told them it was a cost of doing business. He was far above the curb, reading reports from captains and associates who sat on the union side of the table.
or who owned the kinds of trucking outfits that learned to move when called. On paper, the companies were legitimate. On phones, messages carried the unspoken terms. Work stops when we say, and work resumes when we say. A predictable city was profitable. In construction, he saw an even bigger game. Concrete bound every project together. If suppliers fought, prices swung wildly, and schedules cracked. He favored the idea of a club, select companies, steady pricing, guaranteed delivery, and a quiet understanding that no one undercut the group on major jobs. Federal filings years later called it bid rigging and named a concrete club that divvied up Manhattan contracts above a certain size, with a small percentage set aside for the city's underworld commission. His name sat near the top of those papers. He never accepted the premise in public, but he enforced discipline in private. If a contractor tried to go outside the circle, trucks arrived late or not at all. If a builder wanted labor peace, someone explained the terms. When union leaders were arrested and flipped, they described a chain of command that pointed toward his table. He stood apart from the older, noisier model of rule. Agnello Della Croce still held sway downtown, respected by men who favored social clubs and street rackets. The two had roles that balanced each other, an arrangement Carlo Gambino designed. It kept tempers contained and revenues flowing. Della Croce's people controlled card games, bookmaking spots, and crews built on personal loyalty. Paul kept his focus on contracts, envelopes from businesses, and lines that moved cargo or poured foundations. Each camp had loyalists, and for a while the split held. He would call Della Croce old school, in a tone that meant respect and distance at once. He banned narcotics for his family. The rule was bright and clear. He believed drug money brought federal heat, informants, and chaos. The policy didn't stop every ambitious soldier from sniffing at the profits. It did create an expectation that anyone caught dealing would answer for it. That rule would later become a fault line when wiretaps caught talk about heroin on phones, tied to men who wanted to be seen as loyal while still chasing fast cash. He did not like being defied. He liked it even less when lawyers
were offered as shields against him. He reinforced his house as a headquarters without signs. The place on Todd Hill became famous for its proportions and its calm. Dinners were family-first affairs that often ended with a coffee and a few discreet conversations off to the side. A small circle of advisors, older and steady, formed his kitchen cabinet. They were not headline makers. They were dispatchers, shop owners, union hands who knew where choke points lived. He prized a driver who spoke little and watched everything, and he promoted men who met deadlines. That preference is why Thomas Bellotti, a loyal enforcer who handled chores and transportation with tireless reliability, became essential to him. Some saw Bellotti as pure muscle. He saw him as someone who never failed to show up and never forgot an instruction. His thing was to move across the city through proxies. A local head of a key union would call a builder about staffing. A trucking dispatcher would shift schedules to favor one warehouse and slow another. A foreman would softly suggest which supplier wouldn't cause trouble. None of it looked dramatic. All of it added up. When a problem didn't resolve with a phone call, he had another lever: friends in rougher corners. In the late 1970s, he recognized the advantage of an alliance with a tough Irish gang that ran Hell's Kitchen. The group, later called the Westies in courtrooms and newspapers, provided muscle when subtlety failed. The arrangement suited him. If a debt needed collecting or a warning needed sending, outside hands did it. Years later, when the Westies fell under intense federal pressure, cooperators described how Gambino leaders sanctioned certain acts and took a cut. The testimony put his name in the same stories, tying his boardroom style to a pipeline of fear that enforced it. He liked to say that confusion was expensive, so he tried to keep his own house free of it. He insisted that captains report revenue regularly and cleanly. If someone asked for a favor, he required a reason and a plan. He listened for excuses and treated them like warnings. He had little patience for flamboyance. A flashy suit or a loud laugh in public struck him as a liability. That put him at odds with rising figures like John Gotti, who built his base at a Queens social club and drew a crowd wherever he went. Gotti's steady hand at bringing in money made him valuable, but his taste for attention made him risky in Paul's eyes. The more the city watched, the more the government listened, and the more the whole machine could be exposed. He tried to make that machine less visible, but federal agents were learning too. Charges that once targeted street-level crimes shifted into broader conspiracy cases. Grand juries were asked to see patterns, to connect a delayed shipment here with a threatened work stoppage there. And to combine it all into racketeering, he answered with high-priced counsel and brief statements of innocence. He told his people to speak less and keep their meetings shorter. He reminded them that phones were not friends. He repeated the old mantra about never saying more than required. He believed his layers would hold. They didn't hold forever. In 1981 and 1982, investigators devoted resources to him in a new way. Rather than chase his drivers, they chased his rooms. After patient surveillance and careful planning, the FBI placed a microphone inside his house. Years later, agents would talk about the risk: a quiet street, private security, a household that knew every routine. The bug landed anyway, hidden where meals were eaten and plans discussed. The tapes didn't show violence. They revealed a boss talking like a CEO. He discussed payments, appointments, who to promote, where revenue was lagging. He spoke about union leaders like colleagues and about some of his own men as problems to be solved. He talked about keeping drugs off the table and about discipline for anyone who ignored that. He also spoke in ways that prosecutors later quoted at length to argue he was exactly what they had been saying he was: the leader of a criminal enterprise that touched essential industries. Those tapes set up the most sweeping case against the city's underworld in generations. In 1985, federal prosecutors unveiled the commission case, an indictment aimed at the leadership of several families at once. The theory was that the bosses acted like directors of a secret board, settling disputes, taxing certain businesses, and keeping peace between groups so profits remained high. In that filing, prosecutors named him as the head of his family and tied him to the concrete scheme, to labor racketeering, to illegal gambling, and to the arrangement that set a small percentage aside for the so-called Commission on Big Manhattan Projects. A separate case zeroed in on his own family's activities, putting his lieutenants alongside him in a racketeering conspiracy grounded in the wiretaps from his house. He pleaded not guilty across the board. Bail brought another kind of pressure. He was allowed home under strict conditions. He couldn't meet with known figures from his world except his lawyer and a small list. He couldn't travel freely. He could not afford to be seen acting like a boss while a jury pool watched the news. He adjusted schedules, used trusted intermediaries, and grew more reliant on a few people, including Bilotti. Captains who once stood close to him now calculated distance. Some watched the government's case and silently debated whether the tapes could be explained as empty talk or would play like a manager's memo. A few planned for life after him, whether he went to prison or not. The greatest fracture inside his family came from the drug ban colliding with reality. In 1983 and 1984, law enforcement recorded calls and built files that tied men from the Queens crew to heroin and other narcotics. One of those men, Angelo Ruggiero, was close to Gotti. Tapes caught Ruggiero discussing drug deals. The FBI seized the recordings. When word reached him that a key part of his underboss's faction had been caught in exactly the business he forbade, he took it as a test of control. He demanded to hear the tapes to judge for himself who had violated his rule. Ruggiero claimed privilege through his lawyer and stalled, insisting the tapes were out of reach and held by the government. Paul took the refusal as an insult and a sign of disobedience. In his view, a boss asked, and men answered. The standoff widened the crack between the Staten Island house and the Queens crew. Outwardly, he didn't explode. He spoke quieter. He began to consider moves that would send a message. Reassignments were discussed. Demotions were floated. He wanted to remind everyone that the family belonged to the office he held, not to any social club or faction. In private, he stewed over the principle. He never hid his disdain for narcotics. He had told every captain the rule was absolute. To him, drugs meant suspicion, long sentences, and informants desperate to shave years off a penalty. If trusted men were now tangled up in that mess, he wanted consequences. Those close to Gotti feared those consequences would be severe. Another case from this period points to how he tried to manage threats inside his own world. Roy DeMeo, a prolific earner whose crew combined loan sharking, car theft rings, and other serious crimes, brought as much heat as money. DeMeo operated under a captain loyal to Paul, and for years the profits insulated him. As headlines and investigations piled up around that crew, DeMeo became a problem no public spin could solve. In early 1983, DeMeo was found dead, and most accounts from law enforcement and later cooperators pointed to an order that began at the top. The logic was consistent with his method: remove elements that attracted sustained attention. He preferred to preserve the wider system by cutting out liabilities. That calculus, cold and calculated, was part of why some saw him as a businessman first and last. He took a similar approach to outside relationships. If an alliance made money and limited headaches, he nurtured it. If it threatened to embroil him in street headlines, he leaned away. The Westies alliance persisted for years because it stayed useful. On the union side, he invested in ties with leaders whose jobs controlled movement the city couldn't live without. One such figure in a major truckers local became a conduit for influence over deliveries to building sites. When that leader was arrested, courtroom testimony painted a picture of payoffs, work stoppages at will, and negotiations with men whose names newspapers didn't write lightly. He never sat in those union offices, but witnesses said he decided what those offices did. He liked outcomes more than process. His personal life, normally kept in a tight frame, complicated that image of order. He remained married to Nina, whose quiet strength kept the household steady. Over time, he grew close to a woman who worked in the house. The relationship angered parts of his family and seemed out of line with the old values he claimed to guard. Rivals whispered that the boss could enforce rules on others but not on himself. It gave critics, especially on the other side of the family's internal divide, a line they could use to question his judgment. In a world where perception mattered, this dig at his character stuck to him more than he liked to admit. He publicly ignored it. Privately, it added to his list of resentments. By the mid-1980s, he tried to tighten the chain of command even more. He requested that captains visit him regularly, sometimes daily, a ritual that pulled men from downtown to Staten Island through traffic and surveillance. Some saw it as intrusive and risky. Others accepted that the boss wanted eyes on everyone as trials loomed. His goal was continuity. If he were tied up in court, he needed to know his will would still be followed. The more he insisted on direct control, the more resentment he sowed among men who preferred the looser style under Della Croce's supervision. The government's cases advanced step by step. Grand juries heard from former associates, from contractors who described quiet threats, from union men who explained how pickups were halted for minutes or hours to make a point. The recordings from his house found their way into transcripts presented to judges. They weren't explosive to the outsider's ear. They were damning to anyone who understood the context. He discussed percentages and influence in a tone that sounded less like a threat and more like policy. Prosecutors used that tone to argue he was at the center of decision-making. Defense counsel attacked the cooperators as opportunists and framed the tapes as boastful talk. The legal chess dragged on, and he grew impatient with the pace. Then, in December 1985, a key pillar of balance disappeared. Agnello Della Croce died after a long illness. The underboss's passing removed the man who had kept a lid on the downtown camp, who had told hot-headed captains to hold their tongues and keep the peace. Without him, the old division no longer had its stabilizer. Paul moved quickly to install a new underboss and placed Thomas Bellotti beside him, elevating his loyal driver-enforcer to a position normally reserved for a seasoned diplomat. Many in the family took that as a provocative choice. Senior captains with decades in the life wondered why they had been passed over. Men close to Della Croce felt iced out. He thought of it as a message. Loyalty and efficiency would be rewarded over showmanship and politics. Others saw it as a misread of the moment. He sensed the grumbling but believed he could stare it down. He had faced grand juries, contempt charges, and federal statutes built to cage him. He planned to fight the commission case with meticulous preparation and to keep the family earning while lawyers battled. He wanted to make examples of anyone who broke the narcotics rule, to realign crews that had grown too independent, and to lean even harder into the industries that fed his quiet empire. He told himself that discipline would outlast theater. The city still needed trucks, concrete, meat, and labor peace. The man who controlled those lanes would keep the crown. What he didn't see clearly enough was how anger had hardened into resolve in the quarters that resented him most. The Queen's crew felt cornered by his demands over the wiretap tapes and threatened by rumors that he was preparing to demote or worse. Their leader was not a patient man. The gap between Staten Island's tidy dinner table and Queen's crowded clubroom had become a fault line. On one side stood a boss reading financial pages. On the other, a street star who measured respect by applause and cash stacked fast. The federal cases pushed all of them toward decisions they had long postponed. He ended that year still tracking routes, still correcting grammar, still insisting that order could tame chaos. The ledgers were neat. The calendar was full of court dates and private appointments. The city's skyline rose the way he liked, on time. He had managed storms before with quiet pressure. He was sure he could do it again, even with the government at the door and criticism in his own ranks. The next chapter would show how fragile that confidence had become.
The winter air bit hard in Midtown, the kind that turns breath into smoke and corners into glass. Della Croce was gone, the commission case was real, and the whispers inside his own house had grown into full conversations when doors closed. He still believed that an ordered mind could steer a storm, that calm talk beat loud threats, that a boss who held the levers of labor and supply could outlast a circle of critics. He had survived contempt citations, wiretaps he never heard, and headlines that called him the city's quiet power. He thought discipline would settle the room again. He underestimated how fast ambition moves when it smells a vacuum. December brought a chain of decisions. Elevating Thomas Bellotti to the number 2 spot made sense to him. Loyalty, punctuality, and total focus were currency he valued over public charm. Old captains read the move differently. They saw skipped rungs on a ladder that men spend decades climbing. Some reached for patience, others reached for a plan. At the same time, he remained under tight bail terms. Meetings were limited, travel was restricted. The FBI was not hiding its attention. He still kept the same habits. Early coffee, a suit that settled just right, a page of notes with tasks and names. He gave instructions to lieutenants who knew to file details like a clerk. Union posts, suppliers, which Midtown tower poured next, which grocery chain needed smooth deliveries ahead of holidays. He liked the grit of a good week. On the other side of the city, in a Queens clubhouse lit by cigarettes and attention, a different plan came together. Men who had tolerated his rules now feared demotions or worse after Della Croce's death and the standoff over drug tapes. They had worried he would reassign routes, strip crews, or set examples that would humiliate them. They preferred action. They studied his patterns and knew where he liked to eat, who he rode with, which streets his driver favored at certain hours. Law enforcement would later say that a team formed around a single purpose, and that the men who designed it took care to blend in with commuters, to look like anyone else in the 5 p.m. crowd. He dressed the same way he always did that afternoon. He left the Staten Island house with Bellotti, slid into the car, and headed across the bridge toward Manhattan. He didn't carry a sense of danger he could speak about. He had lived with danger so long it blended with routine. The city at rush hour created the theater. Horns, taxis, office workers in dark coats, the glow of restaurant signs coming to life. The steakhouse on East 46th Street drew its regulars. People said he liked the place for its consistency. He believed in consistency. The car rolled to the curb. They stepped out to cross the sidewalk toward dinner and talk. The moment that followed has been reviewed in grand jury rooms, courtrooms, books, and news shows for decades. It doesn't need color. It needs only the point. Coordinated attackers stepped from the crowd and fired. The boss who insisted on order fell on a public street in early evening, and the man he had just raised to underboss fell with him. Sirens followed, then television vans, then a ring of onlookers behind police tape. The evening paper got its headline, and the city understood that a shift had occurred. For all his efforts to run power like a business, to sit at a kitchen table with ledgers and cutlery placed just so, his end came on the sidewalk like an order that could not be appealed. Agents arrived fast because they were already nearby. They had been watching him for years, building cases made of wire, paper, and the testimony of people who had chosen to trade secrets for shorter sentences. Detectives walked the block, took statements, and wrote down every description of every hat and overcoat. Cameras panned up to the steakhouse sign, and then down to chalk marks. Reporters phoned in the names they were already sure about. Inside squad rooms, one conclusion formed: a coup on top of a prosecution. It was both a crime scene and a corporate takeover. The family had to answer the only question that matters in that world: who sits at the head of the table tomorrow? The answer emerged within hours and solidified in days. John Gotti took meetings, accepted pledges, and presented himself as the man who would keep crews paid and problems solved. He filled the vacuum not only with muscle, but with charisma and speed. Some veterans who had felt sidelined by Paul's preference for quiet, older hands saw a chance to be heard again. Others, tied to Staten Island and the kitchen table, drifted into the past with their patron gone. The city learned a new face and a new posture where Paul had avoided photographs and microphones. His successor accepted both. Legally, the death changed some cases and fueled others. The commission case did not stop. The government removed his name from a chair at the defense table and kept playing his voice from tapes recorded in his house.
Prosecutors used those recordings to argue that a hidden board governed certain labor unions and construction markets, that a slice of large concrete jobs flowed upward as a tax, and that disputes between families were mediated to protect those profits. Defense lawyers attacked the premise. They said cooperators exaggerated, that braggarts lied into microphones, and that union politics were messy but not criminal. In 1986, juries convicted multiple defendants in that sweeping case, including senior figures from other families and union leaders tied to the concrete club claims. The verdicts validated the strategy that had put black boxes in dining rooms and turned patterns into counts under RICO. He was not there to hear any of it. In death, he became both exhibit and absence. The most striking voice on one set of tapes belonged to the man who could no longer answer questions. The lines were not the exclamations of a street fighter. They were the measured sentences of someone reviewing income, problems, and policy. That tone helped prosecutors because it sounded less like theater and more like management. When jurors heard him talk about how money moved, they did not need a diagram. They could picture a calendar, a ledger, a list on a clipboard. The funeral lacked spectacle, by design and by pressure. The church had grown wary of ceremonies that looked like parades for men whose lives contradicted its teachings. Police monitored the area. Journalists waited at a distance. Family members grieved a husband, a father, a grandfather. They remembered the man who demanded punctual dinners and preferred a proper roast to any restaurant's best cut. Inside the organization he led, grief mixed with calculation and fear. Some who had served him closely tried to fade from sight, to settle into legitimate businesses or retire quietly before subpoenas found their names. Others bent the knee to the new boss without much choice. Looking back across his life from that winter, the through line is clear. He climbed by treating rackets like enterprises. Prosecutors and agents connected him to loan sharking, sports betting operations, extortion schemes dressed as consulting contracts, and labor racketeering that influenced who worked and at what price. They tied him to bid manipulation in concrete, to pressure on trucking schedules in the garment district, to arrangements with union officials who could deliver or delay. They placed him in the center of a system that extracted money by threatening uncertainty. Pay if you want your deliveries on time. Pay if you want your concrete poured when the forms are ready. Pay if you want quiet on Friday. He denied the charges when he was alive. He hired the best lawyers money could find. He prepared to fight those cases with the same stubbornness that had carried him from a butcher's counter to a mansion on a hill. He also enforced rules that set him apart from some contemporaries. He drew a hard line against narcotics, believing that drug money attracted attention that no amount of discipline could withstand. That choice created enemies inside his own house, men who wanted the fast cash that came with risk. The clash over heroin tapes from a Queens crew didn't just insult him, it violated the principle he thought kept the family alive. Courts and wiretaps would later show how deep those drug conversations ran. The contradiction is part of his story, a boss trying to keep white-collar order in a world drawn to quick, dangerous profit. One case that illustrates his cold brand of management was the end of Roy DeMeo. DeMeo earned stacks of money through schemes that ranged from car theft to loan sharking. He also collected headlines and scrutiny that imperiled the wider family. When it became clear that heat followed him like a shadow, he was removed. Later accounts by law enforcement and cooperators placed the responsibility high, as an executive decision dressed in violence. To him, saving the larger system meant cutting away the part that threatened it. No speeches, no relish. Just an action meant to reset the risk level. It was a pattern he repeated in smaller ways too, reassigning crews, closing clubhouses, freezing out captains who came to meetings with excuses instead of envelopes. His public posture as a legitimate businessman had a foundation. He owned real companies. He studied balance sheets. He met with bankers and accountants who never visited social clubs. He could speak at length about procurement, spoilage rates in meat distribution, or the logistics of getting perishables from cold storage to retail without loss. He cultivated relationships with executives who wanted labor peace without asking many questions. He invested in real estate because rent checks don't draw heat if the paperwork is clean. All of that made him durable and made cases against him hard to assemble until technology and law evolved enough to catch the quiet parts. The house where the FBI placed its microphone says as much about him as any allegation. He kept his world anchored in family and routine. Meals happened at expected hours. Voices lowered when business began. He corrected grammar and posture like a teacher. He loved being a patriarch who provided and directed, and he resented anything that disrupted that tone: loose talk, spontaneous visits, sloppy accounting.
For a long time, officers with badges and notebooks could not capture that atmosphere. When the microphone finally did, it preserved the cadence of his authority. It made jurors and readers years later feel like they had sat at the end of his table and listened while coffee cooled. His alliances show the range of his reach. With union leaders, he obtained influence over hiring halls and dispatch boards that controlled critical choke points. With the Westies, he outsourced muscle to an Irish crew that understood exactly how to turn fear into compliance in Hell's Kitchen. With certain business owners, he offered protection from the very uncertainty his network could generate. The arrangement with the Westies would later appear in courtrooms as a case study in how a supposedly refined approach still depended on the roughest tools when someone resisted. That alliance stitched together boardroom style and street enforcement. By the time his story reached that curb in December 1985, law enforcement had adapted to the world he shaped. Rico stacked together pieces that once looked unrelated, an interrupted delivery in the garment district, a contract that always went to the same handful of concrete companies, a union president who seemed to know in advance which site would need a peace agreement, a boss on a tape discussing percentages like a tax system. In the months after his death, verdicts in the commission case and related prosecutions confirmed that the old wall of silence had cracked. Cooperators described meetings, handoffs, and arrangements that matched the paper trails. Union officers like Ralph Scopo were convicted of racketeering tied to the cement and concrete workers local, reinforcing the government's picture of a market organized for control rather than competition. His personal contradictions did not vanish after he was gone. The relationship with the woman who worked in his home continued to color how people remembered him. Admirers inside his circle praised his discipline, his eye for detail, his insistence on order. Critics in the same world used that relationship, his aloofness, and his promotion choices to argue that he lost touch with the rank and file. Outside the life, employers and workers who navigated the industries he touched held mixed memories too. Some saw him as a tax they had to pay, a cost they passed to customers. Others saw him as a threat that forced difficult choices, close, move, or accept terms you wouldn't put on paper. His legacy is a paradox that keeps historians and detectives talking. He tried to remove the spectacle from organized crime, to run it like a portfolio and a schedule. He avoided public scenes and built rooms where whispers mattered more than shouts. Yet his tenure ended with a public act that became one of the most famous crime stories in New York history. He wanted order. He got an ending that announced chaos. He wanted an empire that looked legitimate. He left behind transcripts that read like board minutes for a secret company. He wanted to be remembered as a man of discipline. He is remembered too as a man undone by ambition inside his own ranks. What followed his death reshaped the city's underworld and the government's playbook. A boss who preferred silence gave way to one who leaned into fame, and that shift drew even brighter lights onto the life. Agents who proved Rico in court doubled down on long investigations. Judges who had once struggled to connect dots began to see lines. Unions where his people held sway faced trusteeships and oversight. Concrete companies within the old club lost their advantages or their freedom. Some of the men who once brought him envelopes went to prison. Others adjusted and survived, because that is also part of the story, a system that adapts even as individuals fall. He never saw those chapters. He left a house, a family, businesses that needed new signatures, and a set of tapes that became evidence against people he did not name to help himself. The Staten Island mansion still stood white against the trees, a monument to the idea that control can be built and maintained like a property. The city continued to pour concrete and deliver meat and move garments and open restaurants at dusk. The machine he ran did not stop because one man did, but the way it ran changed, and the man who changed it could not stand in a courtroom to explain or deny it. His story, told straight, is the story of how New York was built and bent in the second half of the 20th century. Unions that could halt a skyline, companies that looked legitimate, prices that carried invisible surcharges, and a quiet boss who insisted on calm until the night the street said otherwise. The records list the crimes as categories: extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, bid manipulation, conspiracy, contempt. The human version is a set of choices made one after another, always in favor of order that benefited him and his circle. It brought him a mansion and a title, and a long run. It brought him in the end to a curb no one can forget. The city didn't stop moving after that winter shock, but it moved differently. His name shifted from a current event to a file in court archives and a headline others quoted when they wanted to explain how power once flowed without shouting. To understand him fully, you have to slow down and sit with the routines he built long before the cameras arrived, because those routines explain how he climbed and why the government devoted such careful attention to him in the end. He woke early. Coffee first, then the newspapers. Business sections folded so that numbers were close to hand. He liked to mark a margin with a thumbnail, a habit from years of reading ledgers. Calls were made through aides, never directly, and meetings were chosen, not accepted by default. He treated time like inventory, finite, trackable, costly to waste. Long before he held the top seat, his day ran on that logic. When he rose inside the family, he carried it with him. Union schedules, delivery routes, vendor lists, names of foremen and shop stewards. These were his vocabulary. Associates understood that if they wanted his favor, they had to bring information that helped him shape a week. The meat business grounded him. As a young man, he learned that freshness is a race against the clock, and that race requires planning across trucks, storage, and customers who don't tolerate delay. He turned that into a civic lesson. If you control timing in a city, you control money in a city. Charges later brought by prosecutors said he used that insight to squeeze competitors and to collect payments disguised as consulting fees or labor solutions. They described intimidation without theatrics, phone calls, nods, the presence of a name behind a suggestion. Defense filings answered by saying customers chose partners freely and that cooperators in government custody invented stories to save themselves. He didn't argue in public. He let the reliability of his company speak. Orders were filled. Invoices were paid. That was the image he preferred. He brought the same discipline to the garment district, where space is tight and delays ripple quickly. Drivers hate double-parked trucks and blocked loading bays. Shop owners fear missed shipping windows that can ruin a season. Witnesses in later cases told grand juries about fees for smooth passage, about schedules enforced with a precision that felt less like courtesy and more like command. From his side of the river, he read summary sheets and expected envelopes to arrive without drama. He wasn't interested in the table where cards were dealt, or the room where numbers were written on chalkboards. He wanted steady streams that looked like normal business. The line he drew against narcotics fits that plan. He believed that drug money is like gasoline on dry timber, fast fire, brighter heat, sudden ruin. He warned captains that the rule was absolute. That line didn't make temptation vanish. It did give him a reason to act when men in a rival camp were recorded talking about heroin. His demand to hear those tapes wasn't just about catching someone out. It was about enforcing the principle he thought kept the roof over everyone's head. When lawyers were used to stall him, he treated it as a challenge to his authority. That dispute was one of the sparks that landed on dry ground later. He did allow certain alliances that brought him leverage without headlines. In Hell's Kitchen, a tough Irish crew controlled a slice of nightlife and ran its own rackets. Cooperation with them let him pull a lever at a distance when a contractor refused to pay or when a stubborn debtor ignored polite reminders. Years afterward, when members of that Irish crew cooperated with authorities, they described a revenue share and specific favors tied to names from his family. Those stories ended up in court transcripts, where they connected a boss who preferred boardrooms to a supply of fear maintained by other hands. For him, it was a pragmatic solution to a problem. For the public later, it was part of the proof that white-collar order still depended on intimidation. The house on Tot Hill framed all of this. It wasn't ostentatious in the modern sense. It was large, tasteful, calm. A place for family dinners, for grandchildren to visit, for a man to feel he had built something lasting. He lived there with a routine that wouldn't have surprised a banker. Morning reading, midday meetings, a pause before dinner, a careful evening. The FBI eventually planted a microphone inside that house. Agents talked later about the quiet of the block, the risk of being seen, the choreographed steps it took to enter, plant, and exit. The recordings they got were not fireworks. They were steady, methodical, mundane in tone. That was their strength. Jurors could hear him talk about income, percentages, promotions, enforcement of bans, and the expectation that certain businesses pay for calm. It sounded like management, because that is exactly how he wanted it to sound. Those tapes became a pillar in the commission case, the federal attempt to show that the city's 5 families operated like a hidden board. Prosecutors said the bosses mediated disputes, taxed large contracts, and managed entire sectors through union ties and cooperative companies. The concrete field was central. Builders trying to put up towers in Manhattan faced a market where the biggest pours went to a small circle of suppliers at set prices. Witnesses and documents described a threshold. Jobs above a certain value were divided, with a small cut set aside for the organization that kept the peace. Ralph Scopo, a union official, was convicted for his role in steering those contracts. Names from multiple families appeared on indictments. He was one of them, charged with racketeering counts tied to labor, construction, and illegal gambling. He pleaded not guilty. He didn't live to see verdicts, but the case moved forward without him and ended in a wave of convictions that validated the approach of connecting many quiet acts into a single criminal pattern. He also faced separate charges tied to his family's activities, cases that included extortion counts, gambling operations, and influence over unions. Bail conditions meant limited travel and strict rules about whom he could see. That pushed him to rely more heavily on a small circle. He chose Thomas Bellotti as his daily right hand, and then as underboss, a promotion that told everyone where he placed value: reliability, silence, completion of tasks. Veterans who felt overlooked muttered that the boss had become distant, that he preferred men who agreed with him over men who could build consensus across the family. He thought he was rewarding discipline. They thought he was ignoring politics. Both views existed at once. His personal world complicated everything. He remained married to Nina, a partnership that stretched across decades. Over time, he began a relationship with a woman who worked in his home. Her name entered
newspaper columns during the coverage that followed his death. Gloria Olarte. Those stories became a wound inside his extended family and a talking point for critics in his own organization. In a culture that preached loyalty and discretion, the affair was used to argue that he had let personal desire cloud judgment. He never addressed those accusations in public. He closed ranks and kept moving. The house remained organized, the table set, the rules repeated. To understand the control he aimed for, picture a day when 3 calls changed the shape of a week. First, a union officer phones a contractor about staffing a high-rise site on the east side. The message is plain: pick from the list discussed last week and the job will be smooth. Pick outside it and there may be confusion. Second, a trucking dispatcher reschedules night deliveries for a busy stretch in the garment district, telling one shop owner their shipment was moved up as a favor and another that a brief delay is unavoidable. Third, a foreman at a concrete plant quietly confirms that a pour will be covered on Tuesday at a price the builder expected. None of this happens with public fuss. It looks like logistics, but behind it sits an arrangement, and at the top of that arrangement sits a man reading the business pages while coffee cools. When problems occur, someone brings him a version of those 3 calls as a report. He says little. He expects the next week to look the same. Law enforcement learned to see that choreography as a pattern. Early efforts had focused on arresting people for individual acts. An illegal card room here, a loan shark there. Rico let prosecutors argue that the card room, the loan shark, the union vote, and the concrete contract were all expressions of a single enterprise. A tape of a boss in his kitchen talking like a manager made that argument ready for a jury. Add in cooperators who had walked through those rooms, and the story had layers: a voice from a hidden microphone, a witness explaining jargon, a paper trail showing contracts and payments. It took years to build. It held when tested. Looking back further, before he became the face of an era, you see the same habits shaping his rise. In the 1950s, he kept faith during investigations that scared others into nervous talk. He took contempt charges rather than answer questions before grand juries probing the post-Appalachian landscape. That silence bought him a reputation for being unbreakable. Older men noticed. Carlo Gambino valued that quality. Their families were linked by marriage, and their outlooks aligned. Lower the temperature, move money through industries with steadier returns, minimize overt violence, and avoid temptations that draw headlines. When Gambino selected him as successor in 1976, he chose continuity over spectacle. That decision angered the downtown faction, but kept the city's money machine humming for nearly a decade. He promoted men who fit his plan. Captains with access to loading docks, dispatch boards, and purchasing departments did well. Those who built reputations on loud bars and cash flashing under neon did not. He had patience for arguments presented in complete sentences, and no patience for excuses. He could be cutting in small ways, correcting grammar, noting tardiness, remembering a missed promise weeks later, and generous in others, helping a family with medical bills, sending a wreath to a funeral, making a quiet phone call that got a nephew into a union apprenticeship. These gestures reinforced his authority. Power felt normal when it solved small problems as efficiently as it handled big ones. He didn't ignore violence. He tried to regulate it. When a crew's actions generated more heat than profit, he cut them loose. Roy DeMeo's end shows that approach starkly. The crew's alleged crimes piled up alongside investigations and media attention. Removing that risk, according to accounts from cooperators and investigators, was a decision made high and carried out without show. He framed it as self-preservation for the wider enterprise. That same logic applied when someone defied his rules about narcotics. He didn't rant. He planned a response that would remind everyone of the line they had crossed. In a world built on signals, those responses mattered. The difference in style between him and the men who would later replace him wasn't just about cameras. It was about where respect comes from. He believed respect grows from control over essential points in the city's daily life. His successor believed respect grows from visibility, daring, and the ability to draw crowds while still paying the bills. For years, those two theories coexisted under a kind of truce engineered by Della Croce, who could speak both languages. When Della Croce died, the translation stopped. His kitchen table memos clashed with the clubhouse speeches. The break was sudden only in the final moment. The tension had been building since the first time he corrected a man who craved applause more than approval. After he was gone, the government expanded the beachhead those tapes had created. Trustees were appointed to clean up unions connected to the cases. Contractors started to report demands they would have swallowed in silence before. Some companies pled guilty or cooperated to survive, explaining how bids were steered and what labor peace had cost them. The garment district changed as manufacturing shifted overseas, reducing one of the old power centers. In construction, oversight boards appeared where none had existed, and certain contracts that once flowed to a familiar circle opened to broader competition. The machine he designed didn't vanish, but it lost the predictability he had prized. Inside his world, the new guard celebrated a different image, and that image invited a brighter spotlight. That meant more wiretaps, more undercover work, more cooperators, and longer sentences when cases stuck. Ironically, the discretion he had insisted on, the distance between his name and any transaction, protected him for years and made his house bug such a breakthrough. By proving in one case that quiet words could be treated as policy, prosecutors made it easier to pursue successors who preferred loud words in public places. His attempt to run power like a business taught the government to audit that business. He had children, grandchildren, and an extended family that felt both pride and pain in the years after his death. Some tried to live modestly, away from the lingering attention. Others got drawn into the perimeter of cases that reached for anything tied to his name. In interviews, a few family members spoke of a grandfather who fussed over food and manners, not of a boss who shaped city markets. That dual portrait is part of why his story still draws listeners. People want to know how an apparently ordinary routine can mask influence on a city's scale. His legacy is tangled. Employers who paid quietly remember invoices with hidden lines that had to be covered. Workers who enjoyed steady jobs during long runs of labor peace remember paychecks that hit on time. Competitors edged out of contracts remember calls that ended with no choice at all. Agents and prosecutors remember the day a microphone in a quiet kitchen captured the rhythms of an enterprise in sentences that seemed harmless until they were lined up under the letterhead of the United States. Journalists remember a winter evening on a midtown curb. His own family remembers the man who wanted dinner at 6 and shirts pressed the same way every week. Even now, researchers pull records and reconstruct how his name touched systems we take for granted, how concrete got to a form before it set, how a refrigerated truck kept moving on a summer afternoon, how a list at a union hall determined who paid their mortgage that month. They see how he turned small decisions into a structure, one that generated steady money and eventually steady scrutiny. They see how an insistence on order can hide coercion, and how that coercion can look like routine to those inside it. They see how a single house on a hill, with its kitchen and its carefully set table, can be both a family space and the control room of a shadow network. What he didn't anticipate was how modern surveillance would make that shadow visible. He prepared for knocks on the door and for grand jury subpoenas. He wasn't prepared for technology that could sit quietly and turn private cadence into public evidence. In a way, that is the final lesson in his life. He built a world where a soft voice could move cranes and trucks. The same restraint that kept him out of handcuffs for years ended up giving prosecutors the most persuasive portrait of him they could have asked for. His confidence in routine was the very thing that allowed strangers to learn it. There is no tidy moral that erases harm done to small businesses squeezed, to genuine competitors edged aside, or to markets distorted in ways that raised costs for everyone. The story isn't a legend to admire or a warning to ignore. It is a real account of how one man transferred the skills of a butcher's son into the levers of a metropolis and then met a government that adapted to match him.
The record of crimes is plain in indictments and verdicts: extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and conspiracy, all woven into a structure that treated the city's arteries as tools. He denied those labels while he lived and prepared to fight them in court. He ran out of time. The house still stands. The street where he fell still fills with people at dusk. The unions he influenced operate under different rules now. The companies that once depended on a phone call from a quiet table make do with bids and compliance departments. New York keeps building, keeps delivering, keeps opening shops at dawn. His name sits in footnotes and in the memories of those who were there, a reminder that the shape of power isn't always loud. Sometimes it is a slow voice, a marked newspaper page, a schedule that never seems to slip unless someone wants it to. Morning in a union hall begins with coffee and paper cups, a corkboard of names, and a dispatcher who knows which signature matters. That room, more than any corner bar, explains how he built power. A simple list could make or break a week for 40 men. If the list followed the arrangement, cranes turned, trucks rolled, and nobody missed a mortgage payment. If a foreman ignored the list, phones rang and schedules wobbled until the point was made. This quiet choreography was the spine of his reach. Where others chased quick cash on corners, he planted influence in places that set the tempo for construction, distribution, and daily commerce. The garment district made the lesson visible. Every block was a puzzle of loading docks and double-parked trucks. Delays there ripple fast. When a shipment is late, a factory floor goes still, and contracts slip. Witnesses later told grand juries that delivery routes were managed in ways that made cooperation the cheapest option. Envelopes bought smooth passage, work stoppages, time to be brief but memorable, reminded outliers why labor peace cost money. He sat far from those curbs, reading weekly summaries and expecting predictable totals. Prosecutors called it extortion cloaked in logistics. Defense counsel said business owners paid for reliability on their own terms. The outcome of that debate ended up in indictments and verdicts, not in public speeches from him. He stayed silent and let the machine work. Construction carried even bigger stakes. In Manhattan, the concrete pour decides whether a tower rises on schedule. A small circle of suppliers, bound by a tacit club, handled the largest jobs at prices that rarely undercut each other. That club became a central exhibit in federal cases. Testimony described a threshold, projects above a set dollar figure, and a slice set aside as a tax for the decision-makers who kept contractors in line and rivals out. Union officials who controlled hiring and inspections played roles that juries later judged criminal. Ralph Scopo, a cement and concrete union leader, was convicted of racketeering for steering contracts and for acting as a conduit between job sites and higher-ups. His conviction matched what tapes had suggested. The market wasn't free, it was managed, and the management didn't appear on organizational charts. Trucking mattered just as much. Teamsters locals tied to ready-mix deliveries, and heavy equipment gave leverage that could shut down a site without a single threat uttered face-to-face. If a dispatcher moved key drivers to other assignments, a pour stalled. If a steward raised a safety concern at just the right moment, expensive crews waited idle. These were legal roles used in illegal ways, according to prosecutors who traced patterns of calls, meetings, and cash. The picture that emerged placed him near the top of a structure that turned scheduling into leverage. He was not filling potholes himself, and he wasn't seen on sidewalks barking orders. The influence was exercised through layers, with loyalty enforced by expectation, and when necessary, by borrowed muscle. The borrowed muscle often came from outside his ethnic circle, which kept the connection indirect. In Hell's Kitchen, the Westies ran a fearsome crew that policed bars, nightclubs, and rackets in that tight grid of streets. A working alliance, brokered through trusted intermediaries, linked them to his organization. They delivered reminders when a phone call failed and took a cut structured to acknowledge the hierarchy. Years later, cooperators from that Irish group described the arrangement in federal court. Deliveries of cash to Gambino representatives, favors granted, disputes settled in ways that preserved revenue. That testimony placed his name and title in stories where he never appeared in person, perfectly aligned with his habit of staying one room away from any act that made headlines. Another piece of the story sat in slaughterhouses and cold storage. He came from meat. It gave him an instinct for perishable schedules and for the kind of paperwork that looks harmless until you read it with an investigator's eye. Companies tied to him ran legitimate distribution, supplying stores and restaurants. Prosecutors alleged those firms also enjoyed advantages created by pressure on competitors and by union ties that could complicate life for a rival. Defense lawyers countered that any exclusive routes or pricing reflected market strength and customer preference. He cultivated exactly that ambiguity. On records, invoices matched deliveries. Off records, people paid to make sure trucks reached their docks on time. It wasn't glamour, it was routine, and routine is harder to prosecute until someone flips or a microphone starts to hum. His early reputation for silence made that microphone essential. Back in the late 1950s, after a famous rural meeting drew national attention to organized crime, grand juries pulled in anyone with a whisper of a connection. He refused to answer certain questions and did time for contempt rather than cooperate. That decision marked him. Older leaders trusted a man who would take a short sentence to protect a longer career. The word spread that he could be relied on when pressure rose. That trait kept him moving upward until Carlo Gambino chose him as successor in 1976. A choice designed to keep the temperature low and the money steady. Under him, flashy score chasing wasn't admired. Measured returns were nice silence. Silence remained his default even when investigators changed tactics. What began as raids on card rooms and betting parlors evolved into long, patient cases built under RICO. The statute allowed prosecutors to string together episodes that looked unrelated. A meeting at a union hall, a suspiciously consistent pattern of winning bids by select concrete firms, a contractor's complaint about a short delay that cost real money, and a quiet conversation about percentages caught on tape. The hidden microphone in his kitchen house, planted after months of surveillance and careful timing, did not record threats in the classic sense. It captured tone. Jurors heard a manager, not a street fighter. He reviewed income streams, personnel moves, and enforcement of internal bans. He discussed drugs only as a rule to banish, not as something to sell. He did not need to shout. The steady cadence did the work. Those recordings fed the commission case, a landmark prosecution that presented the city's 5 families as a board that taxed certain industries, settled disputes, and kept profits high by restraining competition. Names from across that world sat at the defense table or were listed as defendants who could no longer stand trial. He was among the latter after December 1985. Even so, his words rolled out from tape decks in court while prosecutors walked jurors through charts of unions, suppliers, and projects. They detailed a 2% levy on the largest concrete jobs, the assignment of contracts within a small club, and the role of union officers in smoothing or threatening a job's progress. Defense lawyers pressed hard on credibility, challenging cooperators, and suggesting that the government had misread ordinary industry talk as conspiracy. The jury believed the broader story. Convictions followed, validating the approach that had focused less on street corners and more on the machinery of a metropolis. Before those convictions, he had tried to discipline his house to weather the storm. The no narcotics policy sat at the center of that discipline. He believed that drug money invited informants and long sentences, a combination that destroyed crews from the inside. When agents recorded a Queens crew talking about heroin, and when one of its members fought to keep tapes from the boss by claiming legal privilege
through a lawyer, the dispute turned personal. He saw refusal to share the tapes as defiance and a direct challenge to his authority. That friction, layered over long-standing style differences with the downtown faction, set the stage for the move against him. The outcome on East 46th Street is part of every documentary on the subject. It changed the family's face overnight. After his death, the trials moved on without him. So did the city. But the systems he had shaped didn't vanish in a week. Trustees were installed in unions where corruption had tainted elections and assignments. Oversight boards began to scrutinize contracts in ways they hadn't before. An operation informally known as the Windows case targeted a scheme across multiple families to rig bids for replacing city-owned glass, the kind of municipal work that had once been a quiet revenue stream. That case belonged to the post-Castellano era, but it was born of habits entrenched long before. The logic was familiar. Define a market, divide it, keep prices predictable, and tax the proceeds. As prosecutors went wider, they found the same fingerprints in more places. Agents and U.S. attorneys who worked those cases remember the transition as a change in scale. Instead of arresting bookies and bagmen, they monitored rooms where middle managers in unions and companies acted like hinge points. They learned the names of foremen, dispatchers, and purchasing directors. They watched patterns of lunch meetings as closely as they watched envelopes change hands. Some of that evolution was personal. A particular U.S. attorney in Manhattan pressed hard on the commission theory. Some of it was institutional. FBI squads dedicated to labor racketeering embraced long, document-heavy probes. The result was new kinds of trials and new kinds of sentences. The men portrayed as directors of a hidden board left court in chains for terms that measured in decades. He had expected pressure, but not that kind of pressure. For most of his career, the biggest risk came from a witness in a single case. He managed that risk by staying distant and by keeping the loudest acts far from his name. Technology rearranged the chessboard. One device hidden in a home where he set the dinner hour to the minute pulled private cadence into public record. The transcripts preserved his style. Polite, organized, managerial, and turned it into evidence. He would have called that unfair. In the government's view, it was truthful. Family life complicates any portrait of him. The marriage to Nina anchored the house, a constant from youth to old age. Children grew up in a world where a father's rules, punctuality, neatness, quiet felt ordinary. The later relationship with a woman who worked in the house, Gloria Olarte, broke that picture and drew attention he hated. Relatives took sides, and rivals in the organization used the affair to question his judgment. In a culture that talked about loyalty as a virtue, the contradiction was convenient ammunition for those who wanted him weakened. He didn't answer the gossip. He narrowed his circle and kept working. Private warmth and public coldness coexisted under one roof. Within the organization, promotion choices told their own story. He elevated men who delivered on time and said little. Thomas Bilotti became indispensable because he combined punctuality with absolute focus. Captains who understood union politics and corporate procurement had direct lines to the house on Tot Hill. Street stars with crowds around their club doors had to prove they could deliver stable revenue without extra attention. That preference created lasting resentments. When he placed Bilotti at his side as underboss after Della Croce died, veterans who had waited decades for a chance saw the move as a deliberate slight. He believed he was rewarding the traits that would keep the ship steady through trials. Others saw an executive who misunderstood the need for political coalitions. The other side's view of him hardened into a caricature. Aloof, obsessed with fine food and grammar, more interested in reading about markets than feeling the pulse of a corner. There was truth in some of that. He corrected words in meetings, insisted on suits, and acted like a proprietor in a house that symbolized order. He also understood the pulse better than critics admitted. The entire point of his method was to use the pulse without becoming the pulse, to move markets and schedules with minimal display. His downfall came less from misreading the streets than from misreading how far a rival faction was willing to go to prevent a public rebuke over narcotics. The street answered before the courtroom could. Roy DeMeo's arc shows how he enforced boundaries. The crew brought in money through loans, stolen goods, and frauds that added up. They also brought attention. Investigations, headlines, and rumors about violence. As heat intensified, a decision was made to end the risk. Later accounts placed that decision in his hands, or at least in his approval column. There was no public list of reasons, no shouted accusation. The man whose crew had once been useful was found dead. In law enforcement files and books, the conclusion reads like an executive pruning a dangerous branch to save a larger tree. It fits the pattern seen elsewhere. Step in when a unit's heat-to-profit ratio becomes unsustainable. His daily discipline held until it didn't. Mornings with newspapers, afternoons with briefings from captains, evenings with family dinners. This routine created a sense of permanence. He believed in that permanence. He believed that if trucks kept moving and unions kept steady, the government would chase louder targets. He banned narcotics to avoid the kind of cases that bring life sentences and cooperators. He underestimated how a single microphone and a single internal feud could undo a decade of careful distance. Outside the life, the impact of his methods shows up in prices and choices. Contractors passed costs along to developers and ultimately to tenants and buyers. Shop owners who paid for labor peace raised retail prices. Competitors who refused to join arrangements moved, closed, or fought and sometimes failed. Workers enjoyed stability while the system held, but their union's reputation suffered when trustees took over and corruption cases hit the papers. The benefits of predictable schedules came with a bill that the broader public paid without ever seeing the line item. Journalists who covered him remember the odd combination of invisibility and inevitability. He rarely appeared on camera or stepped into a press scrum. His name, though, connected to major stories. A city nearly bankrupt in the 1970s regains its skyline in the 1980s. A federal prosecutor targets an entire governing structure rather than one crew at a time. A new boss embraces the camera and accelerates the collapse the last boss tried to avoid. Reporters filed from courtrooms where his voice played, but his chair sat empty. They stood behind police tape on a midtown sidewalk where a careful life ended in a public instant. They interviewed small business owners who described attacks for calm they couldn't write off. Agents who trailed him remember hours of nothing punctuated by minutes that mattered. A drive to a meeting that never happened. A short walk around a block with no words anyone could overhear. A dinner with family, followed by a visitor who stayed less than 10 minutes. The absence of drama made the case for installing the microphone. Once it sat in his house, the tone of the investigation changed. The kitchen became a file. Private cadence turned into sworn testimony by a technician who swapped tapes, by translators who transcribed, by agents who lined up dates, and by prosecutors who built a story around sentences that never raised a voice. His name, in the end, belongs to a specific set of charges and a specific style of management. Extortion dressed as consulting, loan sharking that looked like help until the interest strangled, illegal gambling that ran like a channel of steady cash, labor racketeering that treated union offices as instruments, not as representatives of workers, bid manipulation that distorted markets for concrete and glass, conspiracy that linked it all into a model whose efficiency made it durable and whose predictability made it vulnerable once exposed. He denied the labels, pleaded not guilty, and prepared to fight in court. He lost that opportunity when the street chose speed over process. The longer view sees his life as a pivot. Before him, violence and spectacle defined the stereotype of a boss. Under him, control over schedules, unions, and suppliers became the signature. After him, cameras and swagger pulled attention toward a face that the system could not sustain under modern surveillance. He wanted an empire that blended into daily life so completely it looked like a set of ordinary routines. The policy of silence, the tidy ledger, the insistence on discipline, those choices nearly succeeded. What defeated them was a mix of new tools, a broader legal theory, and a faction willing to solve an internal problem in the most public way. In Staten Island, the house stands as a symbol of his idea of power, order, privacy, constancy. People still drive by and tell stories. Some remember a patriarch at Sunday dinner. Others remember a name on an indictment or a byline under a grim photograph. Students of the subject read transcripts and see how a city can be steered by people who prefer a kitchen table to a club door. They see how the labor of thousands, drivers, ironworkers, teamsters, shop employees can be turned into leverage through a few key positions. They see the costs of that leverage tallied quietly in higher prices and limited competition. The tale carries no romance when told straight. It is a record of influence applied at scale, of markets managed for the benefit of a small group, of rules enforced in-house, and of an ending that revealed the contradictions he tried to keep off stage. Those contradictions remain the reason he fascinates readers and viewers. He was both a successful businessman and, according to courts and filings, the head of a criminal enterprise. He enforced rules against narcotics while men under him sought drug profits. He demanded manners and ran an alliance with a crew that specialized in fear. He kept family photos on a mantle under a roof where conversations doubled as evidence. That blend calm surface, hard underside, defines his place in the city's long argument with organized crime. Even the men who replaced him learned from his approach. They kept pieces of the machinery, union contacts, preferred suppliers, pressure points, because those pieces had been assembled well. But the spotlight that came with a different style accelerated reform and prosecution. Trusteeships multiplied. Some locals got cleaned up. Companies once shielded by arrangements found themselves competing for real. Oversight rules hardened. Not every corner changed, and new schemes appeared as old ones faded. Yet the version of order he built proved hard to recreate under the cameras and microphones that now follow anyone who claims his title. So the legacy resolves into two pictures. One is inside a house, quiet and orderly, a boss who speaks in policy and expects obedience without fanfare. The other is outside a steakhouse, sirens and lights, and a nation suddenly paying attention to a story it had mostly skimmed. Between those pictures sits the substance, a career that used unions and industries as tools, enemies made by policy, not passion, a government that learned to match a soft voice with hard evidence, and a city that kept building even as it counted the cost of how it built. He left behind a map without a legend, and in the weeks that followed, everyone tried to read it. Crews tested which phone numbers still answered. Captains sounded out new loyalties. Contractors who had paid for calm asked quietly whether the terms had changed.
The city moved as always. Cranes swung, trucks idled at curbs, union halls posted lists at dawn, but the tone was different. The man who had tried to run power like a clock was gone, and the gears had to decide which direction to turn. Newsrooms picked apart the immediate aftermath. Law enforcement sources said the new face at the top had been ready for the moment, that calls went out the same night promising continuity and fast decisions. The change in style was visible within days. Where the old boss had favored kitchens and careful schedules, the new regime took to social clubs, late-night rounds, and a public presence that drew cameras the old man had spent a career avoiding. Some who had chafed under the earlier order felt liberated. Others waited for a signal that the industries he had tended, concrete, trucking, wholesale distribution, would stay protected. The signal came in the form of reassurance. Envelopes would still be collected. Union allies would still be supported, and builders who played by the old rules would not be punished for past associations. The comfort was temporary. The spotlight that followed a celebrity boss brought heat the kitchen table style had delayed. The government did not pause. Prosecutors had spent years assembling the commission case and related indictments aimed at pulling the curtain back on labor racketeering and bid rigging. They simply removed his name from a chair and kept the tapes. Jurors heard him speak in a steady voice about percentages, about who was in and who was out, about the concrete jobs that could not proceed without the right arrangements. They heard union officers referenced like colleagues and received lessons in how labor peace could be priced. Defense attorneys insisted that the government had stitched together unrelated remarks and believed too readily the stories of cooperators trying to save themselves. In the spring of 1986, verdicts arrived. Senior figures tied to multiple families were convicted. A union leader central to the concrete claims was found guilty. The club that had quietly governed the largest pours now existed to the public as a set of exhibits and a headline. The verdicts unlocked more doors. With those convictions on the books, federal teams moved faster to place trustees inside unions where corruption had been proven, especially in locals tied to heavy equipment and ready-mix deliveries. Oversight boards began to review bids on big projects with a new skepticism. Builders were asked to explain costs that had once been shrugged off as how things are. A case focused on contracts to replace city-owned windows exposed another market organized to limit competition. That prosecution spanned multiple families, showing how rivals cooperated when a protected stream was rich enough. It played out into the early 1990s with convictions and plea deals that confirmed a pattern the old boss would have recognized instantly. Define a field, divide it, fix prices, tax the proceeds. Inside his former organization, stability in those industries became a point of pride for the new leader. But stability under a brighter spotlight is a contradiction. Cameras attracted agents, and agents brought new wiretaps. The very visibility that made the successor a folk figure made his meetings easier to track. Within a few years, tapes and testimony would do to the new regime what the kitchen microphone had done to the last one. The underboss flipped in 1991, telling jurors how decisions were made and money collected. He described plots, politics, and the real roles behind public titles. That turn confirmed the old boss's fear about narcotics and notoriety. Long sentences and famous faces produce cooperators. To measure the old order's reach, you can borrow a clerk's eye. Look at a week of memos that crossed his kitchen table before he died. Monday, a captain reports that a foreman at a concrete plant is now on the preferred list for a midtown job. A friendly union delegate promises no surprises on a Friday pour if certain terms are met. Tuesday, a garment district dispatcher rearranges 2 evening routes to help a shop owner who had kept payments current. Another shop owner late on envelopes is told a driver called in sick. Wednesday, a wholesaler complains that a competitor is cutting into a route. A quiet conversation with a steward at a loading dock soon reminds that competitor of overtime costs. Thursday, a report arrives from Hell's Kitchen that an Irish intermediary resolved a dispute without trouble. Friday, a captain asks permission to shift a soldier to help with pickups on Staten Island. The request is weighed against the narcotics ban and the man's reputation. None of this looks like a movie. It is a chain of small decisions that taken together exert control. He had kept careful boundaries between himself and any act that would look ugly in a courtroom. That is why the recordings were so effective. Jurors didn't hear threats. They heard policy. And policy from the top defines a criminal enterprise as surely as a phone call from a street corner. The tapes showed that he was not an absentee figurehead. He was engaged, informed, and exacting. He talked about who was allowed to make what, who could speak to which union official, and what happened if someone disregarded the line on narcotics. He set discipline by tone, not by volume. When a shop was late, he didn't rant. He simply noted who had to be reminded and by whom. The cumulative effect was the portrait of a man who believed his position made the city more predictable and thus more profitable. His insistence on order produced outcomes beyond money. It altered the culture inside the organization. Older hands who had survived transitions and crackdowns liked his consistency. They understood that a flattering headline evaporates faster than a steady revenue stream.
Younger men raised in crowded clubs wanted faster promotions and more action. The old man's habit of rewarding the quiet and dependable, epitomized by his elevation of a loyal driver to underboss, told them that applause carried less weight than punctuality. When they learned that he was deeply offended by the heroin discussions captured on a Queen's wiretap and intended to act, they moved first. The sidewalk scene in December 1985 was not just an attack on one man. It was a rejection of a philosophy. His choices still influenced how the city worked after he was gone. Trusteeships changed some union halls, but the value of controlling time remained. Construction schedules continued to make or break budgets. The garment district began to shrink as manufacturing moved overseas, reducing one source of leverage he had cultivated. Wholesale distribution adapted as supermarkets consolidated and logistics software replaced a dispatcher's notepad. Yet the basic insight that had propelled him, control the choke points and you control the money, outlived him. The difference was that more eyes now watched the choke points, and more rules shaped who sat in those rooms. There is a temptation to treat his life as either villainy or genius. The truth is plainer and more instructive. He did not invent coercion, and he didn't invent business discipline. He combined them in a way that fit a city whose economy depends on coordination. He put people where coordination happens. Hiring halls, dispatch desks, purchasing offices, and the front desks of suppliers. He backed that placement with allies who could apply pressure without speeches. Then he tried to smooth the whole thing with a layer of legitimacy. Real companies doing real work. Contracts and invoices that could survive casual inspection. A home life that looked respectable from the curb. That layering made the system durable. It also made it vulnerable to a single microphone. The personal contradictions didn't disappear. He was a father and grandfather who loved routines, who corrected manners at the table, who preferred home cooking to most restaurants. He was a husband in a long marriage, and a man who started a relationship with a woman who worked in his home. The name of that woman, Gloria Olarte, entered newsprint after he died, and never left the narrative. Some relatives took offense that reporters returned to the story again and again. They wanted him remembered for providing and protecting on a family level, not for a choice that looked like hypocrisy to outsiders and ammunition to rivals. That tension between private tenderness and public discipline made him harder to flatten into a simple character. People who worked around him remember the details, a specific cologne, the way he held a fork, how he glanced at a clock even during friendly conversations, his fixation on clean collars and polished shoes, his refusal to accept traffic as an excuse for lateness, the hazard of addressing him with sloppy speech. None of this sounds dramatic, but it added up to an atmosphere. Men prepared before they came to the house, not because they feared a shout, but because they feared a quiet dismissal. That atmosphere became part of the evidence when the tapes made it to court. Jurors could feel the control even in ordinary words. Earlier chapters in his legal history underline how long he played this way. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the government's picture of organized crime was still forming, he kept his head down and said little. He was arrested at times for refusing to speak to grand juries, serving time for contempt rather than answering questions about who had been in which room. He was charged in conspiracies related to extortion and illegal gambling schemes, sometimes beating the case, sometimes seeing charges drop when witnesses wouldn't cooperate. He learned that patience had a value. He learned that a boss could survive a dozen scrapes if he never personally touched the hottest parts of the fire. He applied those lessons until RICO gave prosecutors a way to treat the pattern as the crime. Not all of his influence was negative from the narrow perspective of the people immediately around him. Some workers had steadier jobs in the periods when his brand of order prevailed. Some small businesses felt shielded from competitors who might have used rougher tactics in a truly chaotic market. These benefits came with a cost that was paid by the larger public in higher prices, less competition, and a culture of fear that pushed honest people into quiet compromises they would not have chosen freely. He did not apologize for that trade. He believed the city would always be managed by someone. He preferred that the managers sit at his table. Those who came after him couldn't escape his template even when they mocked it. They still sought posts in unions. They still looked for trusted firms to act as fronts. They still collected envelopes from industries where minutes equal money. What changed was the level of attention. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, dedicated squads pursued labor racketeering with patience. Judges saw more RICO cases and had a sense for the patterns. Cooperators described structures that matched paper trails. The culture of impunity cracked. The trial that convicted his successor in 1992 drew on testimony and tapes that would have sounded familiar to any juror who had listened to the old boss's kitchen recordings. The ongoing story of concrete in Manhattan shows how slowly habits die. Even after the club was exposed, builders remained sensitive to the timing of pours, and union contacts still mattered. But the idea that every large job had to pay a tax to a hidden board came under sustained attack, and in many places ended. A new generation of oversight officers, prosecutors, and union reformers, some of them former tradespeople, demanded cleaner elections and transparent dispatches. Companies that had stayed alive by playing the old game faced choices: adapt to a real market or fade. The most successful adjusted, investing in compliance, diversifying business, hiring managers who could navigate a different set of rules. His family had to live with the name. Some tried to step away, building lives that avoided the orbit of the old world. Others were drawn into media cycles whenever a documentary or book revisited the era. A few spoke in interviews about the man who worried about meals and grandchildren, not about the charges that define his public legacy. Those interviews complicate the picture in a useful way. They remind us that men who shape cities also eat breakfast, call home, and hug children. A full account holds both truths at once. Writers and filmmakers return to him because his story bridges two styles. The early gangster stereotype wears danger openly. The late 20th century version he embodied wears a tie, reads the market page, and rarely raises his voice. The sidewalk scene in Midtown gave artists the dramatic image they crave, but the real interest lies in the quiet years where a boardroom tone ruled rackets. Memoirs from law enforcement describe the surprise of hearing policy discussed in a kitchen. Defense lawyers describe the frustration of fighting a feeling, the steady confidence of a man who thinks he has taken the sting out of criminal liability by staying dignified. Both sides saw the same thing and named it differently. There is one more piece that tells you who he was, the way he reacted to sloppiness. He tolerated wide margins in profit but not in behavior. A missed envelope could be a mistake, but a lie about it ruined the week. A captain who admitted a problem and arrived with a plan earned respect. A captain who arrived with excuses earned less, and eventually a new assignment that felt like exile. He measured people against a ruler he rarely showed. Men who aligned with that invisible standard thrived. Men who didn't found themselves outside a circle they had once thought permanent. By the end of his run, he had become exactly what he wanted to be, a patriarch whose word over dinner shaped who got hired, who got paid, and who waited. The government's new tools turned that achievement into a liability. The kitchen microphone exposed the difference between loud crime and quiet command. The lessons read off those tapes guided cases for years. When judges approved trusteeships, when juries heard about windows and concrete, they were hearing echoes of a voice that had tried to domesticate a criminal enterprise. He had succeeded in domesticating it. He had not immunized it. Consider again the lives his system touched. A young driver in a Teamsters local learns never to complain about a reassignment if it comes with a wink. A foreman understands which inspector to call for a friendly visit. A purchasing director in a mid-size firm takes a lunch meeting, hears about solutions, and decides that slightly higher prices are better than sudden delays. A construction manager signs off on a plan that makes a budget line nervous, but prevents an entire crew from idling for a day. Each choice seems rational in the moment. Over time, those choices create a market that looks free but isn't. That is the market he mastered. He never claimed innocence in a way that addressed the system. He denied specific charges. He hired serious lawyers. He prepared to fight on narrow ground rather than debate the big picture. The indictment that named him as part of a racketeering enterprise would have forced that debate, and he might have argued that he was simply a successful businessman surrounded by liars. The tapes would have undercut that claim, not because they are sensational, but because they are ordinary. They make it impossible to pretend that the room ran on accidents. The last irony is that he feared exactly the kind of exposure that consumed his successors. He worried about drugs bringing life sentences and frantic informants, about headlines that poisoned juries, about showmanship that attracted microphones. He built a structure to avoid those pitfalls. He banned narcotics. He refused spectacle. He counseled patience. And yet when the end came, it was a spectacle. Cameras ran. The public watched.
and any chance he had to argue his version in court disappeared. His caution had protected him for decades, but it could not stop a rival's decision to use the one lever he could never fully control. Surprise. The city moved on. It always does. But in every building where concrete was poured during those years, in every delivery schedule that never slipped because someone made a call, in every union hall that posted a list at dawn, you can find traces of his method. They linger in the habits of foremen, who prefer predictability, in the instincts of purchasing agents wary of bargains that look too good, in the questions reformers ask when they see a pattern that repeats too neatly. His story is not simply a cautionary tale about crime. It is a case study in how order can be used as leverage, and how a community pays when that leverage rests in the wrong hands. The length of his influence measured in years, the length of his trial would have measured in months. We will never know how he would have handled cross-examination, or whether jurors would have responded to his manner. What we do know is that the record he left is long enough to teach. It teaches how control over time becomes control over money. It teaches how a ban on one kind of chaos can mask another. It teaches how modesty and presentation can disguise magnitude and effect. And it teaches how a single quiet room, once open to the public by a piece of modern equipment, can reveal everything. He did not live to hear the verdicts, but his voice kept testifying after he was gone. Prosecutors pressed play, jurors leaned in, and a city that knew him mostly by whispers met the cadence of his authority. That steady murmur outlived the sidewalk scene and turned into a guidebook for people trying to understand how influence had been organized without slogans or street theater. The years that followed made his world easier to see and harder to copy. Cameras stayed on. Microphones multiplied. Courts learned the language. Unions that once ran on habit met trustees and audits. The puzzle he arranged began to show its seams. People inside the trades felt the shift first. In locals linked to heavy equipment and ready-mix deliveries, court-appointed overseers started asking for records that had never been kept carefully. Hiring lists were standardized, dispatch logs preserved, elections monitored. A few officers resigned rather than adjust. Others adapted, claiming they had always wanted cleaner rules. Builders accustomed to arrangements started receiving calls from compliance departments instead of late-night intermediaries. The hardest conversations were not about law, they were about time. Contractors said, without saying, that they needed predictability more than anything. Reformers answered that predictability could not be purchased by private fees anymore. The middle ground was a pile of paperwork and new habits. The legal afterglow of his era lit courtrooms into the 1990s. The case about city-owned windows showed how far the old logic had spread. Bids came from supposedly competing companies, but the totals matched more often than they should have. Testimony revealed meetings where who got what was discussed in simple terms. The circle crossed family lines and involved union figures who controlled access to buildings and work crews. Trials and plea deals established that this market, too, had been curated. The same words came up: steering, tax, labor peace, cooperation. The outcomes were familiar: convictions, consent decrees, and a public sense that the price of replacing glass had included a cost the budget committee never saw on paper. His own organization moved in a direction he had warned against. The successor who filled the vacuum chose visibility as a tool, and for a time it worked. Money still came in, clubs filled at night, new allies lined up, but the spotlight had consequences. The FBI, now convinced that long cases paid off, listened from just down the hall in a Little Italy clubhouse. In 1991, the underboss switched sides, describing out loud what the old recordings had implied: how decisions were made, who gave permission for discipline, how money from concrete, trucking, and gambling flowed. He told jurors about the night in Midtown and why it happened. He was the kind of cooperator the old man's rules had been designed to prevent. The ban on narcotics had been a guardrail against that exact moment. Once the guardrail was ignored and fame became an asset, the turn was inevitable. The old boss's mansion stood through all of this as a symbol out of time. People called it the White House for its bright facade and imposing calm. It was less fortress than statement, a place where roles were defined and plans were approved over coffee. Strangers drove past to point and tell stories. Some spoke with admiration they couldn't quite explain. Others shook their heads at the damage a quiet house had done. Reporters returned now and then, using the property as an image for a kind of power that had vanished from its rooms. Real estate agents treated it like any other asset when it changed hands, listing square footage and yards of lawn as if the past were an overlay that could be peeled away with paint. He liked punctuality, something he learned in a butcher's shop where delay means loss. He valued men who showed up more than men who showed off. He kept the vocabulary of logistics close: routes, schedules, margins, overtime. Those habits are unromantic, but they explain almost everything. He took skills from ordinary business and applied them to an extra-legal framework. He placed allies in dispatch chairs and union offices that control the flow of time. He invested in legitimate firms able to accept a steady stream of revenue from work that would always exist: concrete for buildings, trucks for deliveries, meat for supermarkets, gambling that never stops. He avoided public drama, not out of fear, but because he thought drama wasted energy better used converting hours into money. The record of his charges matches that approach. He faced indictments built around racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, a ban on narcotics inside his organization, illegal gambling, and schemes to steer or fix bids. He pleaded not guilty through counsel. He had served time in the past, but for contempt, refusing to answer questions in the aftermath of a national law enforcement push and during earlier grand jury inquiries. Those contempt cases in their own way captured his code. He would accept a short term for silence if it preserved a reputation for reliability. That reputation brought him close to Carlo Gambino and put him in line when a successor was named. When he took over, he tried to run the largest family in the country as if it were a portfolio of dependable returns, each tied to a lever hidden inside everyday life. Prosecutors, after the kitchen tapes and the coalition of cases, described a picture that was both broad and close-grained. They did not argue that he was a street brawler. They argued that he was a manager who used union ties, preferred suppliers, and quiet pressure to keep prices predictable and gather a tax on order. They brought documents, tapped calls, and testimony from cooperators who explained the jargon for jurors who had never set foot in a hiring hall at dawn. They made a word like club mean something precise: a group of firms that avoided competing on certain jobs and paid a percentage upwards for that privilege. They used a union official's conviction to anchor their claim that labor was a tool, not a neutral party. They took his
words about percentages to mean exactly what he meant them to mean. Defense teams pushed back hard. They said businessmen have a right to choose partners, that union negotiations are often tough but legal, that conspirators seeking deals will embroider tales to please the government. They challenged the microphones and the contexts of recorded sentences. They asked jurors to see routine and call it routine. In some cases, this argument worked for other defendants. In others, not. For him, the courtroom narrative remained unfinished. His chairs in federal court were vacant by the time verdicts arrived. That absence lets people project onto him what they want to see. Either a misunderstood executive criminalized for success, or a calculating boss who hid behind contracts and let others carry out the hard parts. The truth sits somewhere simpler. He was a practical mind with a clear idea about which parts of a city turn nickels into dollars. He embraced an environment in which a phone call could halt a project or resume one. He wanted to be the man who placed that call. He banned the kinds of ventures that bring chaos. He expected obedience. He was unsentimental when someone became a liability, as the fate of certain notorious earners suggests. He dressed well, ate with family, corrected grammar, and had a relationship that contradicted the strict ideal he presented in public. He read and referenced business pages as naturally as some men cite box scores. He acted like a CEO and expected being seen as one to protect him from the charge that he directed a criminal enterprise. That expectation was reasonable for decades. It became unreasonable when investigators learned to see management as the crime. If you ask the people who had to live under the system what it felt like, you get mixed answers. A supervisor in the garment district remembers a holiday season when trucks ran on time because everyone paid what they were told. A competing supplier recalls watching contracts slip away for reasons no bid could fix. A worker in a concrete local remembers steady assignments and a union hall that felt like home until federal monitors rearranged it. A small grocer who bought wholesale from one of his firms remembers fair prices and reliable delivery and claims no knowledge of anything beyond the invoice. A contractor says he knew. Of course he knew, but things got done and budgets were saved. A young assistant U.S. attorney who later became famous looks back and says the point was never to argue that the city could run without pressure. The point was to show that private sales of peace would not decide who got built and at what price. You can map his influence onto the changing shape of New York itself. In the 1970s, when the city teetered on bankruptcy, the focus was survival. Public works slowed, private construction shrank, and rackets kept revenue flowing where they could. In the 1980s, as finance, media, and tourism revived the tax base, towers returned to the skyline. That was when his methods thrived. A boom requires coordination. He placed himself in the middle of coordination while staying invisible enough to avoid becoming a symbol. By the late 1980s, the symbol found him anyway. The kitchen tape was the emblem of a new approach by law enforcement. The curb in Midtown was the emblem of a split inside his house. People who specialize in this history will tell you that his biggest lasting effect wasn't any single contract, or even a set of convictions. It was the way he forced both sides to professionalize. He built a model that made sense to accountants. The government built a response that made sense to accountants too. Financial records, purchase orders, project schedules, and union logs replaced fingerprints and spent shell casings at the center of cases. That is why his story still feels current. Modern corruption rarely looks like a shout. It looks like a calendar. There is room here for the man as a person, not just as a set of systems. He was born into a family that believed in work, in putting in hours before you talk about plans. He did not finish school. He learned in shops and on sidewalks. He married young and stayed married, even after his relationship with someone in his home reshaped family dynamics forever. He raised children and became a grandfather. He ran a kitchen where elbows off the table mattered and dinner was served at a time, not a range. He delighted in good food prepared well and in suits that fit. He could be kind in small ways, helping with a bill, calling to check on someone in the hospital, and distant in ways that made people wonder if they were furniture. He wasn't simple, even if his rules were. The argument about whether he modernized organized crime is really a way of saying he put it into a frame the city recognized. New York understands schedules, percentages, and influence. He moved rackets into that frame. People sometimes confuse that with sophistication. It was not sophistication so much as clarity. He saw levers. He pulled them. He wrote little down and let others write it down for him as legitimate work. The government, learning from failure, stopped chasing bravado and started chasing leverage. The two forces met in his house, in a device no larger than a wallet hidden behind a wall. You can't script a cleaner metaphor for how the 20th century closed its books on his kind of power. To check whether we have told everything essential, line up the themes. He rose on silence, starting with a refusal to inform as a teenager, and continuing with contempt citations rather than testimony. He married into proximity to Carlo Gambino, and earned trust as a steady, conservative mind. He built a series of legitimate businesses in distribution, especially meat and groceries, which gave him a public identity that smoothed meetings with real executives. He preferred white-collar rackets, extortion that looked like consulting, gambling run like a ledger, loans that turned into chains through interest, and above all, labor racketeering that turned union offices into instruments controlling time. He forbade narcotics because they destroyed discretion and turned men into witnesses. He invested in alliances like the one with the Westies to keep muscle and arm's length away while securing enforcement. He managed a family like a board, promoted loyalty over flair, and sometimes misjudged the political cost of that choice. He faced RICO indictments that linked concrete trucking, garment deliveries, and gambling into a single enterprise, with a second layer targeting the so-called commission that mediated disputes and took a percentage of the biggest projects. He denied all of it and planned to fight, then died in the most public way in early evening light. His voice and tapes convicted others. His example taught both criminals and prosecutors how to think about structure. If a young person asked what to remember about him, you could tell them this: he made order into a business. At first, that order felt like competence. Projects stayed on track. Deliveries arrived. Workers got paid. Then the price of that order showed itself. A tax on every decision. A fear that honesty would be punished. A set of markets that looked free but weren't. He was not the only man to do this, but he was the one whose routine was captured clearly enough to become a lesson for the city about how control can hide in plain sight. When someone today says that a system is wired, they are speaking, without knowing it, in a vocabulary he helped write. Families live longer than headlines. His did what families do: grieved, argued, adjusted. Some members have asked for privacy and tried to detach their lives from a name that keeps finding its way into documentaries. Others have tried to stand by the memory of a patriarch who provided.
It is not our job to resolve that. It is enough to say that the private man existed alongside the public record, and that the gap between them is part of why stories like his own attract attention long after the calendars he controlled stopped mattering. The city continues to build. Trucks still double park in the garment district, though far fewer factories hum behind those windows now. Concrete still sets on deadlines that can make or break budgets. Union halls still post lists at dawn. Most of the time, these scenes unfold under rules cleaner than the ones he preferred. And when they do not, people look around more quickly for the signs of a pattern. That alertness is part of his legacy too. When a schedule seems too perfect, someone asks why. When a set of bids looks too neat, someone calls a lawyer. He would not have liked the idea of a legacy. He believed in results, not reputations. Yet reputations are what remain. His has settled into a paradox he could have predicted. To some, he is proof that a calm mind can bend a city's rhythm. To others, he is a reminder that calm can conceal coercion. Both can be true at once. The important thing is that we name the mechanisms correctly, so we learn from them. He moved influence into ordinary rooms and tried to make it indistinguishable from business. The law followed it there and showed that the line between management and racketeering is not erased by a pressed shirt. Walk back to a winter evening when office workers hurried to catch trains and a steakhouse buzzed with early diners. A car pulled up. Two men stepped out, one in a role he had earned through decades of steady work, the other in a role he had been given because reliability matters. The city's rhythm paused for seconds that felt longer than they were. Sirens came, headlines followed, cameras found the curb and the sign above the door. People across the country learned a name. What most of them never heard was the voice that really explained him, a patient baritone talking about schedules, percentages, and discipline in a kitchen where coffee had been poured not long before. That voice is the real story. It tells you how the city felt the touch of a man who thought management could keep anything in line. It tells you how a simple routine can become a net. It tells you why, when you want to change a system, you sometimes have to start by listening. If you sit with the record long enough, you see that the same calm that built his empire contained the seeds of its unmasking. The tapes worked because he believed his tone made him safe. The case worked because prosecutors learned to treat tone as substance. The reforms worked because the public could recognize, finally, the machinery behind the price of pouring a floor or getting a delivery at 7:15 instead of 9:30. For all the drama attached to his name, the enduring lesson is not dramatic. It is this: in a city of schedules, control of time is control of money. He mastered that control. The law learned to trace it. The rest of us live with the knowledge that if a routine feels too smooth, someone may be selling the smoothness. He would have called that conclusion sentimental. He would have asked for numbers, names, dates. So give him this: born in 1915 in Brooklyn, butcher's son, 8th grade education, a contempt charge in youth for refusing to cooperate, a long apprenticeship in distribution, a marriage that lasted, a family that multiplied, a connection to Carlo Gambino that solidified into succession in 1976, a mansion on Staten Island that became a headquarters without a sign, a network that reached into unions for concrete, trucking, and meats, a ban on narcotics that defined his approach, an alliance with an Irish crew that acted as insurance, an enforcement style that pruned liabilities, a set of indictments under RICO that named him as a director of an enterprise, a kitchen microphone that caught policy in a soft voice, a death on a midtown sidewalk in December 1985, a posthumous role in trials that convicted others, and a legacy measured in the way New York learned to watch the places where time gets handed out. The rest is interpretation, and interpretation always splits. Maybe he would be pleased that the last word about him is not a shout but a list like a ledger. Maybe he would shrug and ask whether the trucks arrived on time this morning. Either way, the story lands in the same place. He tried to make order the shield and the tool. For many years it worked. Then order itself became the evidence. That is the end of his arc and the beginning of how people now understand the quiet forms of power that move through a city. Years later, the city moved as if nothing had changed, yet people still checked the clock he had set. Foremen glanced at dispatch boards with a wary eye. Purchasing agents scanned bids for patterns that looked too neat. Union members who once lined up at dawn under flickering bulbs now stood before monitors and number systems that pretended to be neutral. The surface was cleaner. The instinct to protect time, to sell calm, had not vanished. It had only learned to whisper softer. What kept his story alive was not the curbside headline, but the quiet method behind it. He proved that influence travels best when it looks like routine. A truck arrives as scheduled. A pour happens as planned. A vote in a union hall goes smoothly. Each phrase is bland enough to pass unnoticed, yet each can carry a price no ledger lists. He pressed that truth into an operating style, then watched it scale from one loading dock to an entire skyline. When prosecutors finally had the tools to show how an unremarkable week could be engineered for profit, his voice became the key that opened the room. The people around him did not speak in grand theories. They worried about overtime on Fridays, fuel costs on Mondays, and the way a rainstorm on Wednesday could wreck a site's whole rhythm. He matched that focus with a steady memory and a taste for details. He liked a clean answer and a cleaner shirt. He corrected small errors because he believed large ones start there. He valued men who delivered news simply and left without drama. He believed that respect grows when a leader never looks rushed. For years, that made him hard to reach for investigators trained to chase noise. The reform years cut on two tracks. There were court orders and monitors. Yes, but there was also fatigue. Some union officers were tired of carrying the past, of watching honest members wonder if the list on the wall reflected merit or allegiance. Some business owners felt relief when a third party took the blame for a delay, instead of a quiet understanding they couldn't explain to auditors. Not everyone cheered. Habits have gravity. Yet the more people trusted written rules, the harder it became for any one voice to run the week from a kitchen. His family kept their own counsel. They knew him as a man who timed dinners, who preferred roasts carved just so, who held grandchildren with a gentleness that did not match the stories on television. They also knew the strain that came when a private relationship burst into public view. They learned to answer questions with silence, as he had done for so long. What they carried was ordinary and complicated: affection, frustration, gratitude, doubt. If you walk through the old garment blocks today, you see ghosts of the world he guided. Fewer sewing floors, more offices, different trucks. The logic of tight streets remains. A double-parked van can stall a morning. A mislabeled crate can ruin a day. Somewhere a dispatcher still juggles favors and deadlines, and the pride of being the person who can fix anything with a call. The difference is the cost of getting that call. It is more likely to be paid in transparency than in tribute, and when it isn't, someone is likelier to notice. People who study him tend to agree on one point. He did not rely on myth. He relied on systems. He turned social ties into a network that ran on schedules. He put money where time could be sold without saying it was for sale. He refused a kind of revenue he thought would destroy that balance. He enforced, when he had to, with as little spectacle as possible. He built, inside a city obsessed with efficiency, a private version of efficiency that answered to him. What undone him, finally, was not a sloppy ledger or a bad week. It was a rival set of values: impatience, fame, and the panic that follows a forbidden risk. If there is a lesson to take from his arc without turning it into praise, it is vigilance. Look for the places where routine offers too much comfort. Ask who benefits when everything runs a little too well. Watch for patterns that repeat beyond chance. The tools that revealed his method: patient listening, long records, careful comparisons, still work. They work in labor, in procurement, in any trade where minutes can be traded like currency. He would have scoffed at a moral. He would have asked whether the next shipment was on time. Yet even he might have respected the craft it took to unspool his threads without tearing the cloth. In that sense, his life and the cases that followed mark a rare moment of clarity between two kinds of order, one imposed by a quiet hand, the other enforced by public rules. The city needs order either way. He showed what happens when the cost of it is set in a private room. Drive past the hill where he once lived. The house looks serene, like any large home made for holidays and ordinary days. Children ride bikes. Sprinklers hiss. The image does not match the role it played, and that is the point. Power that hides in the normal is the oldest kind. He understood that and used it. The law, learning late but learning well, dragged the normal into the light and made a case out of cadence. That is why his voice, not his photograph, remains the clearest artifact. It sounds like management. It was something else. And once you hear it, you start noticing similar sounds wherever a city gives out time.